first like to acknowledge this newfangled contraption here, sister. It captures our images much like talkies.
Oh, Helen, I don't know how we'll fit in there.
Well, welcome. My name is Helen Mary Hume, and I was the oldest child of Thomas and Margaret Hume. I never married. I lived my entire life at our family home on West Webster until I died in 1949 at the age of 74. I lived 29 years beyond the average age of people born in my birth year. This is my little sister Florence. There are 9 years between us.
I am Mrs. Frank McKee. I was married in 1913 in a double wedding ceremony with my sister Constance at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, followed by a reception at the family home. Helen and I would like to invite you all to join us at this year's virtual City of the Dead tour. We are City of the Dead. Keep us alive. See the Facebook event on City of the Dead Muskegon's Facebook page for more information. You'll learn more about us, the Hume sisters, and other citizens with interesting stories from Muskegon's past.
Well, here we are in beautiful Evergreen Cemetery, standing next to Father's monument. Note the Celtic cross. Father was so proud of his Irish heritage.
He was. Do you remember the beautiful Irish point lace on my wedding gown? Our parents were very generous benefactors in the Muskegon community. In 1913, or 1912 maybe it was, they endowed the Hume home to provide a home for the aged and infirm. That was also the year that I got engaged to Mr. Frank McKee, and I was concerned about Father's reaction when Frank was accused of auto speeding and had to appear before Justice Oosterbaan.
Oh, sister, you always did prefer the faster gentleman. That reminds me of all the modes of transportation I took during my world tour in my 30s. I rode a camel to see the Phoenix and the pyramids, and I also rode in a one-passenger ox cart. In order to make the ox go, one had to twist its tail, and it would make the most unusual sounds.
You wrote 160 letters home. I was still a young woman in Father's home at that time. Your letters were so informative and so interesting. And I was concerned, though, about you traveling the world, that you might contract a serious disease.
Oh, thank you, dear sister. I did contract a touch of the cholera on the way home, but didn't contract smallpox or any other serious disease.
Well, I have to say, while I was still in Father's home, I was also worried about becoming an old maid.
You know what? That was the Christmas that Father purchased the Brunswick pool table for $198 and $15 setup. I believe it's still on the third floor of our family home today. I remember writing to you and saying, by the time I get home, this will be an old story and you'll all be sharks, even Father.
I have to admit, Annie, George, Constance, Thomas, and I all felt sure you would be a snooker.
And I was. For those of you who don't know, snooker is more than a game. It means a plebe or a firstie in a military academy. Florence, what would you say is your greatest achievement?
Sister, what a kind question. I feel I completed my marital commitments by having a child and helping advance Mr. McKee's career. What about you, sister? I died 100 years ago at age 35. You lived many years after my death.
Thank you, sister. Well, I was the first woman elected to the vestry at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, where I participated in missionary society work, and I taught Sunday school for many years. I was also a trustee of the Hume home and on the board of directors of the Children's Home. I participated with the Red Cross, with Friends of Art, and with the Women's Club. Of all the people I was honored to meet, Anna Howard Shaw, the suffragette, stands out the most. She was a friend of Susan B. Anthony's and also became the president of the American Women's National Women's Suffrage Association. Besides that, like Mother, I travel to care for sick relatives.
As well I know, since you came to Scarsboro to my bedside when I was stricken with scarlet fever.
Well, happy to help, Florence. If you could have one more wish in life, what would it be?
It'd have to be that I could spend more time with Frank and my daughter Peggy. And you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
We are most gratified by your company.
Those Hume girls, they always were as alike as two peas in a pod. And I see you've come back to join us here at Evergreen Cemetery. In case you don't remember, my name is Mrs. Dennis Smith, Laura. And here's Mrs. Wesley Wood. This is her family gravesite that I'm working on.
Hello, Mrs. Smith. How are you today? I just stopped by to visit the gravesites of my dear, darling children. Mary Sophia died at 5 years of birth. The doctors say it was liver disease. And Edward died at birth. They were originally buried in the old cemetery down on 1st Street. However, due to concerns of water contamination, the cemetery was closed, and my husband Wesley and I decided to build a family plot here at Evergreen. Do you know Mr. Dietrich, who immigrated here from Germany? He built my children's coffins. He is a highly skilled carpenter, and I can attest to his skills in case you were interested.
What was that? How did I get interested in Evergreen Cemetery? Well, my husband, Mr. Dennis Smith, I believe I've talked about him in the past, owns the hardware and dry goods store down on Western. Well, our home was on the corner of 2nd and Webster, and it butted up against that old city cemetery. Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Piper was our next door neighbors, and so they had the same situation. Mr. Piper owned a hardware store just like my husband, and so it didn't take very long before Maria and I, that's Mrs. Piper, well, we realized how much we had in common. We saw what was going on with that old cemetery. It had been in use for the better part of 30 years. And towards the end of that time, you couldn't even drive a carriage onto the roadway because they had been used for burial plots. Well, we also saw how unappealing the new cemetery was, how uncomforting it was to the bereaved. So we decided to create the Ladies Cemetery Association in order to improve Evergreen Cemetery.
Yes, I'm currently the treasurer, and I'm being considered for the 2nd vice president position at the upcoming election. Mrs. Smith, there's openings on the executive committee. Would you be willing to have your name considered for that position?
Yes, I'm willing to consider that. I think it's about time that I changed jobs within the association. You see, because there's no sexton assigned to Evergreen, the association took on the job of plotting and selling the sites. Have I told you that the sites are selling for $5 a piece? But you get perpetual care for that price.
Thank you for all you do for the Cemeteries Association. I will forward a note to Mrs. Piper expressing your interest.
Thank you, Mrs. Wood. You're very kind. Now, we have some lovely sites here in Evergreen ready. However, there are a few spots that are set aside for an auction we plan on having this spring. The money raised from that auction will be going back into improvements for the cemetery. I happen to know that Mrs. Benjamin Piper is on the grounds today. She's the person you need to speak to if you're interested in future improvements.
Speaking of improvements, did you get the opportunity to review my treasurer's report? We were able to purchase a fountain, several trees and some plants, and we have $60 in our budget for next year.
$60? That's excellent. You know, I shouldn't be so bold, but if you're married and your wife cares to make a contribution to the community, the association is always looking for new members. Dues are only $1 a year, and that money goes back into the cemetery. We meet at the home of Mrs. Benjamin Piper. She is a most congenial hostess, and that would be a good way for your wife to enter Muskegon society and meet people.
Evergreen Cemetery encompasses all level of society. Would you like to meet a woman whose death parallels today's pandemic? She died in 1918 during the Spanish flu. I don't think you've heard of her. Her name is Miss Grace Klombach. Would you like to meet her?
Welcome to this year's City of the Dead 2020 virtual tour. I am Grace Kalmbach. I was born in Muskegon and have a passion for sharing local history through storytelling, which is why I participate in Muskegon's own historical theater group, City of the Dead Tours. When I was ailing with the Spanish flu in 1918, I was only 38 years old. I was awarded a divorce because my husband was very abusive for a long period of time. So I was a single mother working in Detroit alone. I marvel at today's technology and how it has advanced since my death. I was so sick and so weak, no one to talk with. But look at your abilities today during this pandemic. You can visit and comfort each other virtually, and we can still share stories together and bring you this year's City of the Dead 2020 virtual tour. Before we begin, please follow a few rules of safety and respect of the dead. Stay close to your tour guide. Stay on the path. Respect gravestones and grave sites by staying hands-free and off. Also, please take a moment to be considerate of your neighbors participating in the tour and turn your cell phone ringers off now. Thank you. Are you ready? Earlier, I mentioned that I worked in Detroit. I honestly loved the independence of being employed as an office clerk at Studebaker Car Company. It paid decent wages for myself and my son Kenneth. At the time, I began to get sick, and much of the country did. Studebaker was making casings for the war effort for ammo, which made me feel needed by the country. When I passed away in 1918 in Detroit, my family brought me home to Muskegon and buried me here in Evergreen Cemetery, and I'm buried in the Harkness plot near the entrance of Evergreen. Now let's see if Mr. Hackley is available to share some stories about his business acquaintances. I always love hearing these tales. Hello, Mr. Hackley. It's so good to see you.
Good day, Mrs. Kalmbach, and thank you for your gracious introduction. My name is Charles Henry Hackley, and I made a bit of a name for myself in lumbering here in Muskegon and other business ventures. I'm glad you folks are able to be with us today in our City of the Dead, and I'd like to focus on not so much my own life as the life of some of my associates who are buried relatively near here. One in particular, whose name is not well known, but who deserves to be better known than he is. His name was Winfield Scott Garish, and as you will see, his life was marked by tremendous early success, but also by tragedy. You see, Garish was born in Maine, and his family moved to Croton, Michigan, north of here on the Muskegon River, where the Little Muskegon River meets the main stream. By the time he was 18, he had learned the lumber trade from his father, who was a lumberman, and was striking off on his own. At first, he was a cadet, actually, at the military academy in Annapolis for U.S. Navy. But that was not going to suit him, and he instead came back to Michigan to pursue a career in the lumber trade. He gathered crews. You have to understand, at this time, lumbering was a wintertime only occupation. You cut large trees. These were the original forests, so the trees themselves were 150 to 175 feet tall and 5 to 7 feet in diameter. They were giants. And the difficulty was, how do you move an object that large, even if you saw it up into shorter logs of 12 or 14 or 16 feet, how do you move those logs effectively down to where the lumber mills were, which were right here on Muskegon Lake, so that they could be shipped, the finished lumber product, shipped across the Great Lakes. Well, the answer was you moved the logs in the wintertime on frozen ground, so you had an icy path so that a large load of logs on a sled could slide, pulled by draft animals, large horses or even oxen, and move them over to a larger stream, a tributary or the main river, and wait then for the spring thaw. When the snow would melt and rains would come and the rivers would rise, then was the moment to put the logs into the river and have them float down to the lumber mills. So that was the stage where Garish began, with increasingly large crews, and I'm happy to tell you that my then partner, James McGordon, and myself were a part of how Garish got started. We loaned him money in today's values, for your folks' information. The amount we loaned him would be $700,000, and that made him a one-third owner with McGordon and myself, one-third owner of a large spot of timberland in Mecosta County, relatively near the Muskegon River. And of course, Garish had to pay us back, pay me and McGordon back for the money we loaned him, but that came out of his share of the profits from that venture. Also at that time, he was in charge of other crews of loggers further away from the river and further north on the Muskegon River. And there it was very challenging, because at that time the winters were sparse as far as the snowfall. That meant that the spring thaw did not produce the large rush of increased volume of water in the tributaries or even the main river. So Garish had his work crews, with intensive labor, construct temporary dams to hold back a volume of water, and then when the moment was right to breach those dams and release that large volume of water to enable the logs to float downstream in the tributaries and again in the main river. And he was very successful at that, and he caught the eye of a gentleman from Cleveland, Ohio, John L. Woods. Woods, by occupation, was a banker, but I would refer to him also as a land speculator in timberland. And he made an offer to Mr. Garish that if he demonstrated his skill at doing this task, this complex task with the temporary dams, that the payoff would be a sum of money and an ownership interest in 12,000 acres of timberland. Now, if you haven't done the arithmetic before, I can tell you that 12,000 acres is more than 18 square miles of timberland. And so it was that Mr. Garish was successful. Mr. Woods consummated that transaction, but now Mr. Garish was faced with a very large parcel of land, beyond 18 square miles, far from the river, and the question of transport. And in that time, Garish himself went to Philadelphia at the Centennial Exposition of the United States, where many new industrial products were being demonstrated for the audience there. In those products was something called a narrow gauge locomotive. In other words, a railroad set up on a narrower set of tracks for specific work purposes, not so much for hauling passengers and larger freight. Well, Garish felt that this narrow gauge railroad would be just the thing, but the problem is you could only shift the locomotives. He purchased 2 of them and a commensurate amount of track, steel tracks, and freight cars, flat cars to turn into freight cars to stack the logs on. But all of that could only reach Everett, Michigan on a conventional railroad, and from there it was going to have to go north up into the woods where it would be used. So at great labor and expense and time and effort, Garish organized crews to build rafts big enough to hold those narrow gauge locomotives one at a time, and the rafts were poled and with ropes, and teams of draft animals pulled up the Muskegon River to their destination, which was a village called Leota in the northern part of Clare County, Michigan, and that would become the head of his railroad. From Leota, he would build the railroad out deeper into the woods, first 6 miles, then 7. And you see, that allowed a much greater penetration of the woods. You opened up a much larger geographic area. You could produce substantially more timber and ultimately lumber. For all of that success, Mr. Garish's life was also marked with tragedy. He had 2 children, a girl and a boy, and neither of them lived beyond the age of 3 months. And that was very moving to myself and my dear wife Julia, because we were unable to have children of our own, so the loss of anyone's child so young touched our hearts. In fact, Julia's favorite charity here in Muskegon was the Muskegon Humane Association, which was in fact an orphanage. And from that orphanage, we drew out a boy named Charles, who, when he became a teenager, we formally adopted. We changed his name to Charles Moore Hackley. Then Garish died, also tragically, fell ill at the home of his sister in Everett, Michigan, and after a very brief illness, he was gone. But his financial partner, Mr. Woods, the banker from Cleveland, then wanted to dispose of the locomotives, the track, the various lumber camps that they operated. It was a huge operation. There were anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 employees, easily the largest lumber operation in the whole Muskegon River Valley, and probably in the state of Michigan. So at that point, my partner, Mr. Hume, and I paid, in today's money, you would say $1.1 million to Mr. Woods to take over all of that operation. We continued the railroad for another 12 years. We expanded it, the length of the tracks. We added locomotives, and that allowed us to harvest hundreds of millions of board feet of lumber in that period until the forests essentially were gone. Mr. Woods died a philanthropist and a multimillionaire, and that in turn was also a lesson to myself and Mr. Hume. And as for the philanthropic aspects of my life, this is how I see it. We needed a town not only where we could make a living, but a town worth living in. You see, a rich man owes his fortune to the entire public. He earns his money largely through the labors of his employees. Moreover, it is my belief that fortune should be expended during the lifetime of the donor, so that he may see that his benefactions do not miscarry and are carried out according to his intent. To a certain extent, I agree with Mr. Andrew Carnegie that it is a crime to die rich. I wish to thank you for your kind attention today, and also to offer my gratitude to my living descendants from my adopted son, Charles, because those living descendants have made possible the restoration of these fine metal gates here at our family mausoleum. I bid you good day.
Oh, Mr. Stevens. Sadly, 3 wives were not the charm. Not the first, not the second, and the third. Well, the city of Muskegon sent dear condolences as he went insane and perished very sadly. Mrs. Smith, you forgot your lilies. Again. What would I do without that woman? What am I going to do with that woman? Oh, hello. How long have you been here? I bet I've been here longer than you have. Welcome to another year in lovely Muskegon and another gorgeous autumn. You found yourself in the middle of another city of the dead. You do know what City of the Dead is, don't you? Well, there's no train to bring you here anymore. I can't promise you a cup of tea. There might be some finger sandwiches. But really, as Mrs. Benjamin Piper, I'm here to serve you some of Muskegon's most delicious cemetery history. I was born in a lovely part of upstate New York. My beloved Benjamin Piper brought me here after we were married in 1844. Our marriage began in 1862. My wonderful Benji and Mrs. Dennis Smith's husband had fierce competition as to who really started the first hardware store in this county. I'd like to say it was my husband. Come along, I've got more to tell you about this gorgeous place. Do you know that it used to be called the New Cemetery? In fact, the first cemetery was actually under the grounds of Mount Zion Church of God, which is on the corner of First and Muskegon, if I believe. Well, the roads certainly have changed, and I believe we've gotten all of our residents from there. I certainly hope so. From about 1864 to about 1869, Mrs. Dennis Smith and I decided to form the Ladies Cemetery Association. What did we do? We turned what was known as a desolate wasteland, yes, those were the words, to this beautiful garden of remembrance over a century later. Now, why do you think they moved the residents from the original cemetery? I'll tell you a little secret. Apparently, buried bodies and drinking water are not a good combination. I want you to think dysentery and cholera. Ooh. Anyways, in 1870, Major Chauncey Davis, who became the mayor of Muskegon, sold us 10 beautiful acres so we could turn this into Evergreen Cemetery. Look what it is now. It's gorgeous. Look at who's here. Do you know how many people are buried here now? You'd be surprised how many people have come to Muskegon. And I can't offer you a $5 burial deal anymore, but I can still promise you a beautiful place to live. Oh, my friend Mr. DeLong is waiting. Nelson! Thank you for coming to this year's City of the Dead. Do remember us. Oh, did I mention the fountain? I forgot the fountain. When we first moved the cemetery here, we planted flowers. We planted many of the trees that are still growing around us. We put up a fence. We dug a well. And we even installed a running fountain. By the way, if you have any idea where that fountain is, can you please let us know? The Ladies Cemetery Association would probably offer you a small reward. Thank you for joining us in this year's City of the Dead. Take care. by from the Piper family.
Hello, I am Nelson DeLong, former lawyer, labor organizer, and two-time mayor of the city of Muskegon. One could say I did a lot. Where to begin? Well, I was born here in Michigan, in Essex Township, Clinton County, and grew up on my father's farm. I attended it at the University of Michigan and graduated in 1871 at the age of 23, making my way into the world of law. I arrived in our fair city in 1873 to establish myself in the town's lawyering trade. I quickly made a name for myself as a member of the Muskegon County Bar, enjoying a partnership in a highly successful firm. Why, I even ran twice for judgeship, though I didn't win in either. From then I moved on to labor organizing, and it's here I'd like to give a little background. In the late 1870s, a sawmill worker would often work an 11.5-hour day, 6 days a week, when his pay wasn't hourly and was likely to be withheld if he left early. It was hard, dangerous, and thankless work, and the working men of Muskegon were sick of it. A spark was struck when a group of German workers refused to work their first day after being told their weekly hours. Word spread of the workers' disobedience through town, and the spark found kindling and began to smolder. The people of this town came from numerous backgrounds, and they often mistrusted each other. On the surface, it seemed as if the pesky Germans, who didn't like their hours, would be ignored. Or that if their action were to inspire at all, it would never be enough to unite a significant portion of the loggers in town. Add to that the difficulty of simply finding the time to organize during a nearly 70-hour week, and the actions of the Germans seemed doubly irrelevant. But the workers in town steadily began joining their newly arrived comrades. It was beside them I found myself in 1881, organizing one of the many famed 10 hours or no sawdust strikes. We demanded shorter hours, and together we shut down Muskegon's lumber mills. The strike lasted 6 months, but ended in failure, with the mill owners offering no concessions and the strikers having run out of the needed finance and to continue the strike. We had lost the battle, but not the war. The following year, the mill workers felt that our needs would not be met by either political party, but the unity we had built in the 10 hours or no sawdust strike could still be harnessed at the ballot box, but I putting one of our number in the running for mayor. It became apparent to the political establishment that we posed a great threat to them. So much so that the Republicans and Democrats backed the same candidate in the 1882 race. But it didn't save them. The final vote count on election day was 611 votes for me and only 133 for my opponent Keating. The victories for the Working Man's Party were continued down the ballot, with our party gaining control of most of the elected positions in city government. Despite the considerable efforts of slander put against me by the local papers, which were largely backed by the wealthiest people in the town, the lumber barons, I was well liked as mayor and re-elected for a second one-year term in 1883. Following my time as mayor, I established myself as county prosecuting attorney, a position I would hold for many years, though it did not dissuade me from throwing myself vigorously into politics from time to time, as stress began slowly but surely eating away at me. In 1896, I was running for public office when my health gave way under her mental and nervous strain mere days before the election. Those near me noted that I seemed not myself, and looking back, I do remember feeling out of sorts. Not long after, I felt suddenly dizzy and was forced to abandon my campaign speech halfway through. It wasn't long before my loved one stood before the Honorable Judge Aldrich's courtroom, petitioning for my admittance to the Northern Michigan Asylum in the hopes of a scientific treatment that might restore my health. And for a time it did. I returned from the asylum much improved, but I knew my life had to change. I moved from our home on the corner of Irwin and Ransom to the lovely town of Pentwater to be closer to my daughter, just in case something were to happen. And it was a good thing we were so thoughtful, because in 1898 my health took a turn for the worse, and frighteningly so. I'm not entirely sure what happened, and there are many things I don't remember. I was told that I was so far distant from myself that I was violent. I had to be taken into a padded jail cell to be kept safe. When I was taken into custody, someone suggested I come home to Muskegon, but the chief noted that the jail here had no padded cell, and I would surely be more of a danger to myself here than in heart. I can't honestly tell you I don't recognize myself in the accounts I've been told of those days. There was no question that I needed once again to travel to Traverse City. While it seemed that perhaps I might improve, I never did leave that place. I don't have a good grasp of the second time I was there. I'm told I had a visitor after Christmas in 1899. He came to me after his own death to ask if I'd known. How could I, though? I was unconscious. He told me that they thought my death was impending, but somehow it wasn't, and I lived nearly another year, dying October 4th, 1900. Isn't it fitting, then, that you come to visit me here not a week after the anniversary of my death? The world has changed so much in 120 years, and yet at the same time it hasn't. If my life teaches you anything, let it be this: even if you aren't the person hurting, stand with them. I wasn't a mill worker, yet the strike Ike was worth every moment. The slander I endured wasn't nearly as bad as the work conditions that had left men to leave their wages behind and bring the mills to a standstill. When I had the chance to carry these stories forward, I did, because as an educated and respected attorney, mill owners would listen to me, even if they wouldn't listen to their workers. Did it change everything overnight? No. But across history, I'd like to think we did something important. And as you step forward, take care of yourselves, and remember, take care of yourselves and each other. And when you need to, let others take care of you too. Oh, here you go, Miss Marsh.
Why, thank you, Mr. DeLong. Well, hello. My name is Charlotte Marsh, and you might be wondering about this baseball and glove, but those of you who have heard of Marsh Field probably have an idea about that. My husband Charles and I so loved baseball that back in 1916, we had a field constructed for the franchise that he frequently headed. Baseball is something that we felt everyone had in common and could enjoy together. The field was used by traditional men's leagues, as well as Negro League games and the Muskegon Lassies All-American Girls Professional Baseball League back in the 40s and 50s. So I should probably tell you about the fact that when we donated that, we made one provision. If it's ever used for anything besides baseball, it will revert back to the family. Now, baseball wasn't our only passion. Charles and I also had a business, C.W. Marsh Company. And C.W. Marsh Company is one of the few businesses that you'll hear about that's family owned and still in operation after all of these years. It's a leather gasket company. Now, this business is so important to the city that in a recent pandemic, because of its important customers like John Deere and Caterpillar Company, the workers at our company were able to keep going as essential workers, and our business did not shut like many others. Well, we're just about to the point where I can point out to you Grace May Kalmbach's final resting place. She's in the northeast corner over here. And like so many others in Evergreen Cemetery, her grave is unmarked. So you might be wondering about my final resting place. Well, you won't find Charles and I out here anywhere. Our names are not on any of these markers. We lie inside the mausoleum, tucked away and hidden. You wouldn't even know that we were there if I didn't tell you about us. But don't pity us, because that place is like a palace inside. Why, it's even heated in the winter. Would you care to see it? I believe that we can arrange that today.
Hello, Mrs. Marsh.
Hello, Miss Alma. I have some guests with me who would love to see the mausoleum. Is that possible today?
Yes. Oh, do you mean they're all in this little box?
It's a newfangled technology.
Wow, well, absolutely amazing. And most certainly, come on inside and warm up.
Thank you.
And here we are, Mrs. Marsh, at your resting place.
Yes, and beloved Charles next to me.
The Evergreen Mausoleum construction was arranged between the city and the Modern Mausoleum Company in 1928. At that time, construction began. The city bought the mausoleum from Strom and added 225 burial crypts on each side of the main hall. The interior is of imported white Italian marble, while the exterior is of Bedford stone, a limestone from Indiana.
Watch your step here. Oh, thank you so much for the tour.
Well, you are very welcome. It was so nice to have visitors. Do you or your guests have any other questions about the mausoleum?
Oh, that is a good question. Why is it heated in the winter?
The mausoleum is heated to protect the marble and the limestone from the elements. Otherwise, if they weren't climate controlled, they would crack.
Well, it does give comfort to the residents too.
Oh, that's fantastic to hear. Well, thank you for visiting with us, and I will see you later.
Thank you so much. We should probably continue on with the tour now. We always felt that we were so fortunate to have made a successful living in Muskegon at the Leather Gasket Company. Charles originally came to Muskegon to work in a factory making leather bicycle grips, but that factory closed shortly after he got here. Now, it was quite a large step from working in someone else's factory to having his own successful leather packing company. And it wasn't just hard work that got him there, but also the help of others. So, like many others in our time, and probably yours too, we wanted to give something back to the community that could be enjoyed by everyone. And that's why we donated Marsh Field. We also had a scholarship fund to help people go to college in Muskegon who couldn't afford it otherwise. Well, many, many others in our beloved Muskegon were not as fortunate as we, but their lives shaped our community as much as our own. I'd like to introduce you to one such resident here in Potter's Field, where all but 2 of the graves remain unmarked. Good day, sir. Are you up to accepting visitors?
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm sure, Mrs. Marsh. You all know about the Potter's Field, right? This is where all the poor and scorned, unlucky enough to be without family or anyone who cares to pay for a more formal plot. We're full of spirit. I wish I could tell you more. I tell you, I was alone here in Muskegon when I came down with that so-called Spanish flu. You know, it wasn't really Spanish. I had heard about some cases down in Kansas, in an army camp, back in 1917, right after I came up from East St. Louis. That boat full of our boys flew over to Europe. The Spanish were just the first to be honest or stupid enough to let their media, let the news tell the story when they first had their outbreak. But yeah, our boys. You can thank President Wilson for that. I've been living down in East St. Louis though. Right in 1917, during that hot summer, ooh, there were, I think, 3 big race riots. Y'all don't have those anymore, I suppose, but you know, Houston, Philadelphia. But then East St. Louis was the big one. And they say I started it, but that's just because I had sense enough to shoot back at that carload of upstanding white citizens when they came back around the second time after they drove by and just shot into a crowd of Negroes. It was well, we were ready for them. But then that was the big one. Sure enough, couldn't stay there. I came up to Muskegon on the trains through Chicago just because I'd heard that the lumber camps up here have blacks and whites working side by side. Just, well, I don't suppose I really believed it, but I had to come see for myself. Only problem was I was too late. By the time I got here, wasn't much lumbering being done anymore, so I was left to enjoy my my own little case of the flu in the fall of 18. Which was good luck. Right up my alley, because you know, it wasn't like today. I hear the epidemic y'all have to deal with is taking more black people than anybody. It wasn't like that. They say anyway, in 1917, we were less susceptible. Although they tried to blame it on us anyway. In Chicago, they said all us migrating from the South must have brought the disease with us, but truth is, less black people died of that than white people. I was just one of the lucky ones. And now, I guess I ended up side by side with all these fine white citizens anyway. Lost. Just a splash of coffee in the cream of Muskegon's low society.
Greetings, friends. My name is James Balbernie III. I came to Muskegon in 1865 with my father in order to establish the Balbernie mortuary business. More about me later. Let us continue the tour. I see we are approaching the gravesite of a dear friend of mine, Maria Piper, who did so much to beautify the Muskegon Cemetery. We're approaching the grave of a friend of mine, George Uthwaite. Unlike Charles Hackley, Mr. Uthwaite did not leave a legacy in the form of buildings with his name on them or other such monuments, so to speak. However, he had a great impact on the enterprise known as the City of Muskegon through his business efforts and civic efforts. Greetings, George, my friend. Good to see you. Let us hear your story.
Hello, good people of Muskegon. I'm George Frank Uthwaite, and I was asked to make an appearance today and speak a little bit about my life, but I'd much rather talk about my contemporaries to whom we're all indebted. You see, my work was more behind the scenes, and quite frankly, that's where I was most effective. My brother JR brought me to Muskegon in 1859 and put me to work making shingles. We opened a lumber store together, and after a few short years, I sold my interest back to JR and began developing properties. We financed and constructed an entire block of business and retail space on Western Avenue. The city of Muskegon adopted its charter in 1870, and that's when I became involved in civic affairs. Some friends and I backed L.G. Mason to become Muskegon's first mayor, but it was Chauncey Davis who won the election. I never cared much for partisan politics, but at least the city administration alternated between Democrat and Republican over the next 20 years. My only successful run at office was in 1872 when I was elected recorder. Maybe you call that city clerk today. The following year, I was appointed to the post of superintendent of the poor. A little bit more on that later. They called me a positive person and quite progressive. I was on the original board of the Library Association, formed in 1869. Muskegon's first true public library? Well, no. The association was formed through stock offering, and the collection was open only to members and their families. Credit should go to my friend Charles Hackley, who opened Muskegon's first public library and reading room in 1888. But our collection was turned over to the public schools in 1876, and not everyone was on the Watch Us Go bandwagon back then. We used to hang out, congregate at the corner of Clay and Jefferson and discuss issues of the day. I remember listening to this pessimist we called Dismal Jonas complain that the city would drown in debt if an upcoming waterworks issue were to pass. Well, I was able to point out that Muskegon had assets for every single dollar of debt. And further, I told him, show me a community where the people are too mean to spend money on public schools and public improvements, and I will show you a community that live men will avoid as they would smallpox. Dismal Jonas said he did not wish to argue further. The naysayers were right about Muskegon needing a better tax base to support the city and public improvements. We needed better connections to the outside world and the region. I was part of a harbor committee that went to Washington and got funding for our harbor improvements. I was on the board of a group of investors. I was a trustee that secured land and built a rail line that connected us to Grand Rapids and to Indiana. I was on the board of trade. where we were able to convince investors and entrepreneurs that there was plenty of money right here in Muskegon to get their businesses off the ground. We attracted Muskegon Fire Engine Company, Chase Brothers Piano, Sargent Manufacturing, and many others. Well, I hope my legacy is defined by more than just my advocacy for transportation, commerce, and manufacturing, because I'm just as proud of my service to the community as superintendent of the poor. You see, when the Great Fire of May 16, 1891 destroyed 17 city blocks of houses, including my home on Muskegon Avenue, hundreds of us were left at the mercy of others for shelter. A quite humbling experience. I built another house on Peck Street, where my dear wife Helen continued to live after my departure from this earth in 1893. But I worry so much for her welfare. What would happen if another devastating event came her way? Would she be taken care of? I certainly hope so. I appreciate your stopping by this day, and I've enjoyed your company immensely. Thank you.
Now I would like to tell you my story. I was born in 1831 in Ontario, Canada. In 1865, I married my wife, Ellen Watson. And in 1865, we moved to Muskegon. While I was growing up in Canada, I had several jobs that helped my future career, such as cabinet making. And my father and I came to Muskegon first to begin the Balbernie funeral home business. Our business flourished in Muskegon and became renowned in the whole region for the quality of care that we provided. And of course, we had the most high quality and modern equipment, including our buildings, one of which had powered ventilation, something I think in this modern era you take for granted. We had 2 fires, neither of which were covered by insurance. However, we were able to recover from that, and our business continued to flourish. I added a retail furniture store downtown to my list of business ventures. I was involved in civic life in Muskegon a great deal. For example, I helped to bring the first motorized ambulance to Muskegon. Back when they first started being motorized, they used electrical motors. I also was elected mayor for 2 one-year terms. Unfortunately, shortly after I began my second term, I was shot in the chest and killed by John Tayer. Mr. Tayer had been director of the poor for the city of Muskegon until shortly before this tragic event. And he had been noticed by many to be strongly disturbed mentally. Although in 1899, when I passed away, I was only 61, I have much to be grateful for. My life was full. I had the love of my family and the privileges of a good education and wealth. I have nothing to be regretful about regarding my life. I was wealthy and had all the advantages that brought. To conclude, I would like to read a short article that was in the Chronicle in 1899 that was prompted by Mr. Tayer, who as director of the poor. It is a short list of the conditions of some of the cases of poor people in the city of Muskegon. An elderly couple, the man sick beyond hope of recovery, both without means. 3 orphans, aged 5, 9, and 14, for whom he, Mr. Tayer, would like to find homes. At 40 Israeli Street, 2 young girls keeping house for their sick father and brother, who should have better homes and something to do. And 1 at East Forest Avenue, a young girl dying of consumption who was being boarded by a kindly family for the present. At 12 Terrace, a needy family, both the father and mother sick, the former seriously so. And now let us move on to the gravesite of the wife of my assassin, Mrs. Tayer. Hello, Mrs. Sturgeon. Good to see you, and I would first like to express my deep sympathy to you for our shared tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Lucy Tayer Sturgeon.
Thank you, Mayor Balbernie. And yes, we do have a shared tragedy. I was born in 1846, and my life was not much to write home about. My story is more about my husband's. My first husband was John Tayer. He was elected as Director of the Poor in 1897 by Mayor Balbernie, and again in 1898. The winter of 98 was especially hard. At that time, we had 150 families who were on the city rolls for the poor. My husband spent $900 to support those families that winter. We had 3 orphans who were looking for a home. We had a number of people who were indigent. We had people who were ill, who had no other means of support. That was the job that my husband lived for. Unfortunately, in '99, my husband was not reappointed as Director of the Poor. Mayor Balbernie didn't give much of an excuse except that he wasn't satisfied with my husband. My husband took that very much to heart, and it worried him. And I'm afraid that he became obsessed with the job. He would take every day and go into the office and go over the books to make sure that there wasn't anything that he had done wrong. He was so afraid that people would think that he was taking money or spending it unwisely. But that wasn't the case. It upset him so much that he became nervous and disoriented and worried, and he couldn't stay still for any length of time. He would go into the office every day. And finally, on June 29th, 1899, became one of the worst days of my life. Shortly after noon on that day, my husband met up with Mayor Balbernie in front of his own store. They had a short discussion, and the next thing people knew, he took out his Civil War pistol and he shot Mayor Balbernie. Shortly after that, he stepped back into the alleyway that he had come out of, drank carbolic acid, and turned the gun on himself. I found out about it about 2 hours later. I had been at home waiting for him to come home for lunch, and one of the neighbors came by and told me about the news. I fell apart. My husband had been a Civil War veteran, and he had been mayor of the Director of the Poor. He was a good man. But when this happened, my life fell apart. Because he had been a Civil War veteran, I was entitled to a widow's pension. I lived on $12 a month, which in today's money is about $395. That put me in the same position as the other people that my husband had been helping. 5 years later, I married my second husband, John Sturgeon. Now, John Sturgeon was a completely different man. He was the first mail carrier in the city of Muskegon, and he did that job for 17 years. He was also the first man in Muskegon to draw 2 federal pensions. He was a Civil War veteran, and he got a Civil War pension from the United States government. And being a postal worker, he also drew a pension from the U.S. Postal Service. Now, his daily mail route was a round trip of 18 miles, most of that on foot. It was 9 miles out and 9 miles back, and he never missed a day in 17 years. The mail went through regardless of the weather. John and I were married for 26 years. With my first husband, I had 2 children that didn't make it out of childhood. The first one died before he was 1 year old, second one before he was 10. My second husband, brought 2 children into the marriage. By the time that he passed in 27, we had the 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. I followed him a year later, and at 82, I figure I led a very fulfilling life. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us with Muskegon City of the Dead. We have talked about being poor, and we've talked about being rich. In Muskegon, the rich were generous enough to help the poor. We have been through pandemics. I lived through 2 pandemics. The things that we have had are not so different from what the things are that are going on now. Please support us. Any donations would be generous. And thank you very much for joining Muskegon City of the Dead.